impoverished. Hey. And King James, possibly, can be the only means to support an impoverished and sinking nation. Not a great catch here. From the beginning of the Glorious Revolution, some Scots had resented the clear attempt on the William Mead side to force Scotland to follow the English example. Some Scottish peers and gentlemen had not kissed William's hand after his coronation as King of England, looking upon it as giving up the rights and independence of their nation. The Scottish regiment mutinied when they heard the decision to send them to the Netherlands. Explicitly stated they were not English. However, Lord Stair and Lord Talbot won some support among the members of the convention, tailoring the reasons in favor of the Union according to the political inclination of their interlocutors. To William's friends, they said that in the present distressed and distracted state of England, Scotland would obtain better terms than she could expect at any other period. To King James's supporters instead, they hinted the possibility that entering the discussion on the Union would prolong also the terms for the decision on government to the advantage of the loyalist cause. In the end, however, and despite of the fact that commissioners for the Union were appointed after William and Mary had accepted the crown of Scotland, the project was not successful. Interestingly enough, in his instruction to his son, King James branded supporters of the union between Scotland and England as enemies to the monarchy, Scotland as it is being a great support to it, which would be none of it united, which is to say, swallowed up by England, as it was in Cromwell's time. Probably in the aftermath of defeat in the Battle of the Boyne, in the eye of the disillusioned king, Scotland looked already as the only real hope for the Jacobite cause. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ugo. So now we have our colleague John Young, senior lecturer in history at the University of Strathclyde, Scotland. So you do have the floor, and you're going to talk about political actors, protagonists, and processes.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to remain seated for my presentation this afternoon on the 1707 Act of Union, political actors, protagonists, and processes. So, in some respects, there are links to some of the previous papers this afternoon, Susan and Ugo's. We had James's great vision for a perfect union, which didn't work out. And also 1689, plans for a union and no negotiations took place. Well, in 1706, negotiations did take place. They succeeded. And in 1707, a new union did come into existence on the 1st of May, 1707. So what was failure became success. So there's a bigger picture here. So what I intend to do today in the presentation is to give an overview on the political processes in which the 1706 Treaty of Union was negotiated, looking at the key politicians and the key political actors who were involved in that process. Likewise, giving an overview of the political management of the Treaty of Union, primarily through the Scottish Parliament, and if time permits, the English Parliament. And there is actually a very important English dimension to this, which is often forgotten about by historians of England. So whereas the Act of Union is a huge topic in the history of Scotland, the Act of Union in English history, looking at textbooks on the history of England, is a minor footnote. So you need to understand us better. Likewise, there is a methodological approach that can be taken looking at the role of political actors in the context of the history of political institutions. And for me, as a historian of Scotland, I have been strongly influenced by that. So in the Italian university system, you have professors in the history of political institutions. We don't have that. So I have been very influenced by that type of approach. So whereas in the terms of the history of Scotland, the Union of 1707 had arguably primarily been viewed through the prism of economic history. 15 of the 25 articles were to do with economic issues, therefore it's a de facto economic treaty, or is it actually? Or, in terms of the history of Scotland, the treaty is associated with bribery. And a lot of that is there in Scottish popular culture and in parts of the independence movement. We were bribed, and that's why the Union came about. Serious historical research obviously indicates that things were much more complicated. So who were the key political actors? And how did this treaty go through the political institution of the Scottish Parliament? Likewise, we were just listening to your paper. Who were the political actors on the committee for settling the government who drew up the claim of right? So you can do profiles of politicians. It can come through the records of the Parliament of Scotland, the history of Parliament for the English, and then the British Parliament, supplemented by very useful sources such as the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. So looking at the 1706 treaty negotiations, it's important to note that the negotiators were chosen and appointed by Queen Anne. So this takes us back from a Scottish context to the 1st of September 1705, arguably a turning point in the history of Scotland. When debating Scotland's future, when debating Anglo-Scottish relations, the union of the crowns as a marriage, James's dream, by the early 18th century, this marriage was over. It was going to the divorce courts. It was finished. So what would the future be? And late in the evening of the 1st of September 1705 in Edinburgh, the Duke of Hamilton stands up and proposes a motion that the Scottish commissioners to negotiate a treaty should be chosen by the Queen. Many members had already left the House to go for food or drink or both, and the motion was carried. So there's a chronology here, there's a chronological framework, which is quite important. Negotiations had been held in 1702-3 and they had failed. There had been some movement, but they had failed. So negotiations took place in 1706 between the 16th of April and the 22nd of July. Largely a 3-month negotiating period. The negotiations took place at the Cockpit in London, in Whitehall. So actually looking at the treaty commissioners, 31 commissioners on both sides, a good degree of common membership between people who were commissioners in 1702 and people who were there in 1706. So 39% roughly of the Scottish treaty commissioners in 1706 had served in 1702, and 45% roughly of the English treaty commissioners in 1706 had served in 1702. So people had experience of negotiating and what some of the issues were. It's also very important, I think, to recognise the factional nature of the negotiators. So quite often, in a basic historiography, it's about the Scots and the English, Scotland and England. But we're dealing with politicians who were aligned to political factions. So in terms of the Scottish treaty negotiators, these were dominated by the court party, the Queen's or the government party, and the Squadrone Volante. They made up the Scottish factional profile. The English commissioners were dominated by the Whig faction. And apart from the Archbishop of York, there were no Tories. So yes, we have Scottish commissioners, yes, we have English commissioners, but we've got the court, Squadrone, Whigs, who negotiate a treaty which results in 25 articles. I'm not going to talk about the articles, but Professor Torrey. Likewise, Queen Anne, who quite rightly has been rehabilitated as a monarch, important monarch in English and British history, played an important role. Queen Anne was a political actor. Queen Anne wanted an entire union, and she attended the union negotiations, the treaty negotiations, on several occasions to encourage the negotiators and to be fully informed about the progress of the negotiations. So Queen Anne is quite important here. So in terms of the process, the negotiations opened on the 16th of April. Opening speeches by William Cowper, Lord Keeper of the Great Seal of England, and James Ogilvie, Earl of Seafield, the Scottish Chancellor. Negotiations began in real-time conditions on the 22nd of April. Initial English proposals for a United Kingdom, a common parliament, and the Hanoverian succession were agreed on by the Scots fairly quickly. And any notion of a union, only an entire union, was acceptable to the English negotiating side. So this is something in the historiography of Scotland that's important, that the Scottish treaty negotiators could have negotiated a federal union if they had wanted to do so. But if we think of the court Squadrone factional outlook, I don't think they were really interested in that, and the English negotiators certainly were not. In more technical terms, the treaty commissioners appointed several important committees. Right, so within the negotiations, a large commission appoints different committees to do different things. So on the 25th of April, a committee was appointed to revise the treaty minutes about the progress of the negotiations. 5 members from each negotiating side. From the English side, this included John Smith, Speaker of the House of Commons. From the Scottish side, these included, for example, Hugh Dalrymple of Stair, Lord President of the Court of Session. His name will pop up quite a lot. So here we also have someone who was a lawyer, and I think this is something that certainly on the Scottish side we can do more work on. Lawyers who were parliamentarians, and lawyers who were parliamentarians who were elders in the Church of Scotland. So individuals who operated within different institutions, such as Parliament, the Church of Scotland, and the legal profession. So Hugh Dalrymple of Stair is quite an important example of that. On the 1st of May, 1706, a committee of equal numbers was appointed to conduct a review and consider the revenues, debts, and income streams of both Scotland and England. So although the treaty consists of 25 articles, arguably the most important were the first 4. And then once key issues had been agreed in principle, they got down to the nitty-gritty of negotiations regarding economic issues. And in terms of that committee of May 1706, Both the English political heavyweights, as treaty negotiations were there, as were the Scottish ones. So, for example, Chancellor Seyfield, the Duke of Queensberry, and the Earl of Stair. And the Earl of Stair is the John Dalrymple Stair that Hugo was talking about. He had been promoted into the nobility. In terms of the English side, key members of the Whig junto were on that committee. The Earl of Sunderland, Lord Wharton, and Lord Somers. So these are really quite important people. By the 25th of June, a further committee is appointed to draw up the articles of the treaty, the heads of the treaty, the order of the articles. 4 negotiators from each side, 8 in total. Scottish commissioners included Hugh Dalrymple Stair, Sir David Dalrymple, who was also a lawyer and was Hugh Dalrymple's brother. And they were all part of the Dalrymple family network, the Earl of Stair, Hugh Dalrymple Stair, Sir David Dalrymple, and there's a couple of other ones as well. They're everywhere. They're a big legal family, they're lawyers, they're parliamentarians, they play an important role. By the 22nd of July, the negotiations are complete, and the articles of the Treaty of Union were presented to Queen Anne at St James's Palace. Speeches again given by Lord Cowper on the English side, the Earl of Seyfield on the Scottish side, and then Queen Anne gave a congratulatory speech to the commissioners who were assembled. So in terms of the negotiated treaty, it went first to the Scottish Parliament and thereafter to the English Parliament. So the treaty did not pass through both institutions simultaneously. The Scottish Parliament was a single chamber institution. The English Parliament is a 2-chamber institution, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. So the process is it goes to Scotland first. So a key issue would be what would happen if the Scottish Parliament refused to ratify the treaty, which people like Queensberry were well aware of. So the treaty went through the final session of the Scottish Parliament, which opened on the 3rd of October 1706. The treaty itself was ratified on the 16th of January 1707. Parliament was adjourned on the 25th of March, but did not meet again. So in terms of the Treaty of Union going through the Scottish Parliament, who were the key political actors who successfully managed that process? The Duke of Queensberry, the High Commissioner, who's often been described as a kind of godfather figure in terms of the faction that he controls, the people who were loyal to him. Chancellor Seyfield, Secretary of State Mar, who in 1715 is the Jacobite leader. John Dalrymple, Earl of Stair, who's often forgotten in this. The Squadrone Volante, whose votes, of about 25 or 26 votes, secured the treaty. These were the votes that delivered the treaty, the Squadrone Volante. From a position of weakness and unreliability, the Duke of Hamilton, leader of the opposition, whose weakness and unreliability undoubtedly helped the treaty go through and weakened the opposition. Likewise, we have the strategic failure of the Jacobites, arguably. 10 Jacobite peers refused to attend the Scottish Parliament because they would not take an oath recognising Queen Anne as the legitimate monarch. Was that a strategic mistake? So we have the picture of a strong court party, a Squadrone Volante whose combined votes secured the treaty, and a weak country party opposition. In terms of political management or managerialism within the single chamber, there was a tight grip on parliamentary procedure. So Seafield and Mar, Chancellor Seafield and the Earl of Mar, controlled procedural business. They controlled the number of speeches and the length of speeches given, and they also controlled the order of voting on the articles of the treaty. You know, so the articles of the treaty were debated and voted on individually. With regard to parliamentary debates and parliamentary oration, a very important role was played by the Earl of Stair. And according to Daniel Defoe, who was a spy in Edinburgh at the time, Stair was justly reputed to be the greatest man of counsel in Scotland, and Stair had been an eminent instrument in carrying on the Union. So Stair was a gifted speaker, a gifted debater, and a parliamentary orator. He played an important role in the debates on Article 22 about Scottish representation in the British Parliament. There was a heated debate round about the 7th and 8th of January 1707. According to Defoe, Stair gave an extraordinary speech on Article 22, which carried a lot of weight. Unfortunately for Stair, he went home and died in his sleep. So that's 1 week before ratification, and you lose one of your key players or leading people in the court party. Sir John Clark of Penicuik, a pro-incorporationist, a treaty negotiator, allied to the Duke of Queensberry, stated in his memoirs that Stair attended the House every day, supporting in forceful and outstanding speeches the cause which he saw as the only remedy for all his country's woes since the Crown were joined, the 1603 Union of the Crown. And it is to this great man above all that Britain owes whatever good it sees emerging from union. Now, obviously, Clark of Penicuik was partisan because he fully believed in a union of incorporation as the best way forward for Scotland. But it does indicate the value and esteem in which Stair was held by the court party. Likewise, within the final session of the Scottish Parliament, we have the issue of parliamentary committees, and there were not many. But a key committee that was appointed was the Committee for Examining the Equivalent. And the equivalent was Article 15 of the treaty, which was to provide compensation for the Company of Scotland and the Darien project, as well as to do with debts. This was formed on the 23rd of October, 1706, with additional members on the 28th of November. And that committee was to examine the mathematical calculation of the equivalent. Are the numbers right? And indeed, two professors of mathematics, Thomas Bower from Aberdeen University and James Gregory from Edinburgh University, reported to the committee, verifying that the mathematical calculation was correct. So this was a very important committee because Article 15, the equivalent, the Jacobite George Lockhart of Carnwarth said this was the mighty bait. This is what pulled people in to vote. Again, that's a Jacobite analysis, but it's still quite important. So who were the political actors on the equivalent committee? What was its factional profile? 60% of the equivalent committee were members of the Squadrone Volante, and the rest were court party members. So the factional composition of that committee was Squadrone and court party. And that's quite interesting because the Squadrone Volante, as individuals, had invested quite heavily in the Company of Scotland and would get a return on their investment. That doesn't mean to say that's why they voted. I don't think that's why they voted for union, but it's an important issue to bear in mind. So the committee for examining the equivalent, which was dominated by the Squadroni and the court, was examining and reporting on one of the articles of the Treaty of Union, which had been negotiated by the court and the Squadroni. So that's quite interesting. There's a wider political significance to this committee. It had a political function. So the equivalent committee was important for managing the treaty through a single chamber Scottish Parliament. And according to one historian of the Union and Jacobitism, Alan McInnes, the equivalent committee allowed the court party and the Squadroni leadership to shape the ratification of the treaty. It gave them the upper hand, and it also weakened the ability of the opposition, in his opinion, to challenge the treaty. The equivalent committee also dealt with some other issues regarding fiscal rates, the coin, trade and customs. It's very interesting. It was given the remit of conducting a full investigation into a major riot in Edinburgh on the 23rd of October 1706, which Daniel Defoe witnessed and thought he was going to be murdered by the Edinburgh mob. The Edinburgh mob going through the streets of Edinburgh, banging a drum, no English, no union, hunting the provost, the former provost of Edinburgh, and Defoe thought he was going to be murdered. That committee was given the remit of investigating that riot. So was that a way of investing publicly, relating to public disorder? Unfortunately, we can't find it. No one can find the report that was ever written on that issue, but it's very important. Then moving on, if we look at voting behaviour on the treaty, the first vote took place on the 4th of November 1706 on Article 1 for a United Kingdom. It had a majority of 33. The treaty as a whole was ratified on the 16th of January 1707 with a majority of 41. Other key issues on the Hanoverian succession, a majority of 59. For the Presbyterian Church government, a majority of 75. For a unified British Parliament, a majority of 30. And on the issue of free trade with England and our colonies, a whopping majority of 135. Follow the money. Now, more seriously, all the votes on the 25 articles of the Treaty of Union have been analysed through historical databases. And just to give a basic overview, this has indicated the strength of discipline in the voting behaviour of the court party and the Squadroni Volante. They held their votes. So you had strong party discipline. The Squadroni Volante was crucial because it was the votes of the Squadroni that delivered that union. 25 to 27 votes is round about that. Their votes got the treaty over the line. On the other hand, the country party opposition was weak and the Jacobites were ineffective. Moving on to the 16th of January 1707, this is actually quite important. It actually comes back to Susan's paper, it's fantastic, because the negotiators in 1706 were not allowed to discuss religion. Right? So religion with regard to the Church of Scotland and with regard to the Church of England had to be dealt with differently. So on the 16th of January 1707, the Scottish Parliament passed an act ratifying and approving the Treaty of Union of the two kingdoms, Scotland and England. That act consisted of the 25 articles of the Treaty of Union and an act for securing the Protestant religion and Presbyterian Church of Scotland. So the Act for a Presbyterian Church of Scotland and a post-British Union of Incorporation was dealt with in a separate act and then combined with the treaty to give you the Scottish Act of Union. Now that's quite significant. Now, in terms of this issue then, about religion and the Church of Scotland, we have political management here too. Because, as Karen Bowie from Glasgow University, very important work has shown the role of petitions and addresses against the Treaty of Union from parts of Civic Scotland and from parishes in the Church of Scotland and some presbyteries. Only 3 presbyteries did address against the Union. So with regard to the Church of Scotland, it had an executive committee called the Commission of the Kirk. It was an executive committee that sat between general assemblies. So the Commission of the Kirk, its membership had ministers of the Church of Scotland and it also had lay elders. So the Commission of the Kirk was politically managed to hold back or negate opposition within the church to the treaty, which was, from an impartial point of view, a brilliant piece of religious political management. So who were the political actors who made that happen? Who delivered that? Very important person, William Carstairs, minister of Greyfriars Church in Edinburgh, principal of Edinburgh University, had been court chaplain to William of Orange, came over with the invasion fleet and was a key Scottish advisor to King William. Carstairs was informed of the progress of the treaty negotiations. Daniel Defoe recognised his gifts. The Secretary of State, the Earl of Mar, recognised his gifts. And Carstairs was a crucial member of the Commission of the Kirk. So he was a member of 10 of the 13 committees of the Commission. So he's got a high profile in religious committees of the Church of Scotland dealing with the Union, such as the Committee for Public Affairs, the Committee for Speaking to Members of Parliament, the Committee for Drawing Up Church Concerns for Security, etc., etc. So here we have William Carstairs and the management of the Church of Scotland. However, we also have lay elders, ruling elders on the Commission of the Kirk. So the court party and the Squadrone Volante, within its factions, employed lay elders in the Church of Scotland to manage issues relating to religion. So, for example, with regard to the court party, one important lay elder in the Church of Scotland was David Boyle, 1st Earl of Glasgow, who was also the Scottish Treasurer. The £20,000 sterling that was sent from London to Edinburgh for the distribution of arrears of salary went to Glasgow. And Glasgow was meant to burn the evidence, but he never did it. And that's why we found out in the 18th century. So then you've got the Scottish Treasurer, £20,000 sterling, but he's also a ruling elder in the Church of Scotland. Another person that I haven't mentioned, but he was there in everything else that I've spoken about, Adam Coburn of Ormiston, another lawyer and a parliamentarian. So we have court party elders and we also have Squadrone Volante elders. For example, a really fascinating individual, Patrick Hume, 1st Earl of Marchmont, who in 1685 hid in a hole in the ground with his Bible in the aftermath of the 1685 Argyll Rebellion for his religion, escaped to Holland and came back on William of Orange's invasion force. He sat in the 1689 convention illegally, incidentally, but he's promoted into the nobility, Earl of Marchmont. The Chancellor of Scotland at some parts of the 18th century. So Marchmont is there as a ruling elder and was a very, very strong defender of Scottish Presbyterianism. Another lay elder was George Bailey of Jerviswood, who was one of the leaders of the Squadrone Volante and who represented the Shire constituency of Lanarkshire in the Union Parliament. So in terms of political actors within the institution of the Church of Scotland, William Carstairs and lay elders from the Court Party and the Squadrone Volante played a very important role. So that gives us a Scottish perspective, and I'll just summarise very quickly. This will be in more detail in the published article, but on the English perspective of the treaty going through the House of Commons and the House of Lords, it's not that I'm negating that part to it, it's just that this conference is mostly about Scotland, but I'll give more to the English dimension in the finished article. So really a key role in terms of the English Parliament was played by the Whig Junto in securing the ratification of the treaty and the Commons and the Lords. There was Tory opposition in the Commons and the Lords, primarily about the security of the Church of England. How will the Church of England be protected in a new British Union where we've got Presbyterian Scots up there who've got a church? So we can also look at that through the prism of political actors, not just the high-profile English Tories who were against the Union, but other Tories further down the food chain who spoke out against the Union to defend the Church of England. And for me, I think that's quite interesting, because then you can look at their political profile and the constituencies that they represented in the English Parliament. So I think, to give a final conclusion as food for thought, and also in terms of the remit of this conference, the Act of Union, or the Acts of Union, that came into existence on the 1st of May 1707, that continue to this day, were the product, arguably, of a factional alignment of political actors, protagonists and politicians from the Court Party, the Squadrone Volante in Scottish terms, and the Whigs in English terms. So are we looking at two acts of union that were the product of the Court Party, the Squadrone Volante, and the Whigs in England? And on that note, I'll finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So we have the last intervention of today. Our colleague Alessandro Torre, Università di Bari. The Treaty or Act of Union 1707 as a legal source.
Penso che Professor Young for his very detailed description of the proceedings and of the date referred to the Act of Union. Well, what can the constitutional say about the Act of Union as a legal source? Well, of course, in the light of the constitutional history, Scottish Union of 1707, the Union once agreed by the Parliament, Scotland, and England is a England. It was a draft political unity of the whole political area that is known as the British Isles, and is a legal source of a primary, I should say essential, crucial importance in the period of time turbulent transition. Far from being a common document within English unionist project, the treaty and the subsequent parliamentary acts that came soon later and were separately voted by the parliaments of England and Scotland and embodied in a civil text, are among the most powerful sources of constitutional law in the evolution of the British Constitution. Making sense of the assessment of the Union that has been for 300 years a matter of diverging interpretations of English and Scottish legal historians and constitutional law is not so easy. The discourse is that the connections between the Kingdom of Scotland and England, political, economic, constitutional connections, and so on, were very complex in the early years of the 17th century. I can over-summarize by saying that in the time, the Scottish-English relationships were not so friendly. Indeed, they have never been friendly. And that the idea of a unification was politically under influence of England because of the economic position of the Scottish kingdom and of its historical political life. On the English side, if we look at the growing need of military security and economic balance in a time of international integrity, it may mean that the way to a radical institutional change was seen south of the border as the best solution of the time in a region that was disunited and where the English supremacy was in contest. In other words, the unionist trend was not a merely Scottish problem, but a matter of a much wider state in the English mind that was growing in the English mind, and where the use of briefing was becoming the password of the time, since the Union of the Crown. In the early 16th century, Scotland was an independent kingdom with nearly all the elements of a true constitutional system. A king and the parliament. I say something about the king, but it is just the same about that. A parliament, the unicameral states, working as an association body, just like many political assemblies of medieval language. A peculiar legal system, the Scots law, a bridge between common and civil law, and nonetheless open to influence of some parts of the common law, just because the Romans were many traders who were into the English market. Some ancient universities, Glasgow University and St. Andrews, settled in the late Middle Ages, and before becoming the cornerstones of the pro-unionist Scottish Renaissance, were influential political units of the nation. An established church, whose general assembly was the most influential religious and political body of the Presbyterian Church. A peculiar organization of local authorities, the royal courts, that was under the coordination embodied in a convention acting as a true pressure group on the political life of Scotland. On the paper, the rich network of political and cultural institutions was a platform of a sense of national identity that was the most apparent among the other non-English areas of the British Isles. Just looking at the whole matter through the eyes of a contemporary constitutionalist, we can help to remember that in everything Vincent Wales was just little more than a peripheral academic province assimilated to the English kingdom. And the westward, because to see the political pattern of Ireland was behind that of a Protestant colonial settlement within a large Catholic environment. Let's remember the controversial thesis by Michael Heffter, who was speaking of internal colonialism about the English and Irish historical relationships. The modern constitutional consciousness of being a nation in the two Celtic countries was not so developed like it was in the historical Scotland. But since 1703, under the surrealistic form of the Union of the Crowns, established under King James, the Stuart kings didn't sit in Scotland, and their relationships with their native country were weak, cold, and often scornful. In short, under the White Crown, Scotland had indeed a king of her own, but it didn't sit in Edinburgh, but in London, and her governance was a mere virtual. It means that the Scottish kingdom was openly neglected, felt to be like that, and for over a century, preserved a devious position between a proud self-confidence in the inherited institutions and a standing economic weakness, largely dependent on the plans and hostile behavior of English trade capitals, financial interests, and pastoral politics. So it's not surprised that in the era of the 1707 Union, the Scottish National Institution and civil policy might be in the lowlands much better than in the far north, were becoming well aware of their identification into the spirit of a centennial self-government, or the self-government. By the way, on the other side of the border, some concern was increasing, focused as it was on the clash between A, the transitional attitudes of the new successful form of parliamentary government coming from the post-revolutionary settlement of 1699, and ruled by a crown led first by a Protestant king and later by the last appendix of a fading Stuart dynasty. B, in an affluent England, the awareness of the danger coming from the birth of a revival of the Stuart pretender and the turning point of the new dynasty coming from Jack. They knew that the Irish settlement should be electoral and all that, but what kind of king should be for Scotland? It is same. Such being the main constitutional question on the floor in England, the wealth of the two kingdoms was there here indicated as directly against a retrograde wish of the monarchy in the events of the dynastic turnover. This led to a weak position in the international war that was on since 1720. From that, the necessity to ensure a safe coverage against the competition that was behind the border in a turbulent and dissatisfied Scottish state, sitting under the spirit of the old alliance. New political and economic conditions of France were established, where the Stuart pretender was actively supported by the king. The king of France, of course. Because of that, in the eve of the opening of the debate on the Union, a new and worrisome illness and other Scotland. It was the blessing in Westminster of the Canon Act 1705, whose aim was serious to prevent all Scots from supporting the Stuart cause on suggestion to the English throne and envisaged deadly restrictions to the Scottish trade of passing goods toward England. Serious economic damage, exclusion for the Stuart supporters. The presentation by our learned colleagues on the University of Stirling has been very clear about the main political steps that the Scotland will lay on the Union. He explained that the background of the early 17th century transition was not so plain because, let's forget for a while the constitutional disease, that could uncomfortable economic and political position of Scotland in the Israel context, and its asymmetric, concrete connection to the much more powerful English condominium and also English political groups. The work of the Squadron 1 is in short, Scotland was not a legal partner of England. Because of such a weak position, the lines of the Scottish political system became somehow untenable, owing to the crack of the colonization in the end. His time started in the late 1690s. That after was a failed attempt to improve the port economy of a large part of the Scottish ruling class and smooth out the financial disease of the government that support the investors. The sharpening power of the Italian colonial enterprise and the exasperation of the financial crisis even affected the Scottish investors who took part in the business. Some of them tried like to obtain some relief from their political support to the Union in Parliament, as well as in other political bodies of the country. Speaking in a confidential mood, a very confidential mood, of course, the well-known Merciless wares bought and sold for English gold, coming from Poland by Robert Burns in 1991. May be seen as a commonplace or even as a sort of political gossip. But it might help the continental observer to see the focus of the English-Scottish confrontation on the Union and try, so we can try, and if we want to try to understand the text of reference on which the Union was agreed, and probably we had some chance to understand what happened in the backstage. According to the preliminary debate that the review in both countries, it is a fact that the ultimate target was to create the Union. Like that, the project was not enjoyed before a large share of the Scottish civil society, but supported by a significant amount of Scottish members of the nobility and of the ruling class, who suffered the consequences of the political instability and of the dying affair. A lot of them, mostly unionists, were appointed by the Queen as commissioners to the trade. It is no use to speak about the divide between political opinion in England, where the unification was agreed, basically where widely agreed, not so much. Anyway, and Scotland, where on the point many people had considered with this that lasted a long time after the passing of the Union. Since the constitutional name of the new Union was generally suggested as of Great Britain, the official invitation was to establish a complete unification, and the roadmap of the constitutional agreement was clearly divided into two main stages. We can summarize them as the treaty making and the law making states. Ambassador Ward, who led the world treaty, was in charge of a sort of an union-oriented diplomacy, whose task was intended to set up the comprehensive text of the common union and accordingly to propose a shared understanding on its legal rules to be later submitted to the separate legislators in London and Edinburgh. In short, the Commissioner's terms of reference were to draw a preliminary legal form of the Union, to put on a prior method of unification, and to send the document to be called as the Articles of the Union. The Anglo-Scottish deal it was not really so far from other treaty-making summits in the modern age, where because of the relevance of the interests and the plurality of people attended, they were asked to meet in different places. So it was known treaty was there was separately agreed in two cities, Houston and Oslo, and later transformed into White Treaty of its hour. The two commissions from England and Scotland even met in 5 cities back in London, but apart the fact of not really meeting the plenum of the commission, but in separate apartments in Westminster. Actually, there was no way to join and discuss together and be able to have the unite about the commission whose sketches were proposed by the English partners and submitted to the Scots through written communication that were scrutinized in a short time and signed on the 25th of June 1796. With the support of over 100 English commissions and 27 out of the, please correct me if I'm wrong, Scottish, in 22 July 1906, the 25 commissions became the 25 articles of the Union. And were approved by the two parliaments in Edinburgh on 16 January 1907 by a narrow majority of votes, 116 against 89, and in London on 7 March 1707 without the formal vote of the Houses. Besides, something more is due to be told about what happened in the House of Lords, where some influential dissenters tried to persuade their noble colleagues that the future of the two kingdoms and of the two parliaments was a serious risk for England. No mention of the undesirable encounter of two so different national cultures and traditions. Their view was to reveal how, in a hastily political union, the serious clash was coming from a legal and spiritual confrontation between the Church of England and the Scottish Church. We know that the Church of England is a constitutional institution under the command of the Crown and control of the Parliament. And this confrontation was turned into a serious hindrance to the integrity of religion and the cohesion of Parliament, and in the last analysis to the authorities of courts. The third clash between the Anglican Church and the Scottish Church was openly prevented by the Act for Securing of the Protestant Religion and Presbyterian Church Law, enacted in Paris in 1907. As a pre-union law, just to make easy the union agreement, where the legal status of the two national laws were acknowledged and secured forever. This act is expressly voted, was expressly voted in the preamble of the Act of the Union and can be seen in a spin-off as a spin-off of the ratification of the 20 About the net of the recomposition of the religious polemics, it was quite clear that for all members of the two commissions that the parliamentary fusion was the main constitutional achievement of the Union. In other words, just in a play of the Chinese hypnosis, the improvement of the economic well-being and of the security of England was the true target of the English ruling class. Then, the fusion of the kingdoms was understood as the most obvious constitutional change as a way to put an end to an uncontrolled dual role in the governing of the new state. The parliament unification was enacted as a device to make the Italian constitution. No. The historical momentous passage from several parliamentary systems to a united rule was actually an energy of the Scottish leadership in Westminster. And about this transformation, the criticism of some English lords was nearly the same of Scottish dissenters. The former imagined the parliamentary fusion as a natural alteration of the traditional balance of the English constitution coming from the Lord's Revolution. The latter simply reflected the end of an autonomous parliamentary body and a serious defacement of the Scottish nationality. On one side, the birth of a union parliament, obviously safely located in Westminster, of course, was the most apparent event of the new state that, without the true discontinuity in its evolution, enforced the English supremacy. In short, the 17th unification of the legislature did not stop the growth of a parliamentary evolution in what we used to call the golden century of the British constitutional story. On the other side, Scotland lost their power, but retained nearly all the traditional institutions of their constitutional system. And though in a minority position, the Scottish members of Parliament were able to enjoy some political advantages, and it is to say, new financial payoffs. Not the same happened in Italy, for example, where the mid-18th century unification of the whole kingdom delayed all the pre-unitary legal systems and the constitutional laws. Some of them, as in Tuscany, for example, were much more advanced than the legal system of the state of Sardinia. But a widespread Scottish dissatisfaction about the union all the way to the Jacobite Renaissance, whose progress started in the ethical law of the states, as the people said, when the treaty was arrived last until 1700. Under the stately surface of the act, an inner dissent became steady feature of the public opinion in Scotland, where an interested support obviously came from the merchants of governments, from many members of the European, and later, when that late State of the Union was pacifically settled, somehow pacifically, was questioned by argument from the main causes of the Scottish Union. Anyway, the end of the story was that the treaty became a single act, where all the above mentioned articles became without any deviation, and just with some minimal amendments. The 25 articles of the by which they begin to communicate in the full source of state law. The passive enactment of Act was, of course, in Article 1, the union's command by which the two kingdoms of Scotland and England became on first lines 1907, a single kingdom of Great Britain. Then the two kingdoms of Scotland and England shall all the first time be united into one kingdom. There's a stress of the one means that there is no way to think of two nations, but one nation. Now I think that from this is starting with the effort of the United Kingdom as an English government to persuade people that there is a British nation. Directly coming as a last rule of the Act of 1701, the confirmation of the Protestant suggestion was enacted in Article 2, where the House of Hanover was openly designated and had claims from the Catholic side dismissed and openly ruled out from Scotland, from Scottish successor to the crown. A further rule of constitutional debt is Article 3 that in its tenth prerogative saying that the United Kingdom of Great Britain be represented by one and the same power to style the Parliament of Great Britain. Two constitutional elements come from them. A, the provision of a new parliament, the proclamation of Parliament of Westminster Parliament, or yes, the new Parliament as the two political bodies of the new state. The Scottish contribution to the new Parliament is enacted in Article 22, 16 representative peers and 45 members of the House of Commons. Article 25, the creation of a great seat of Great Britain. The seat is important because it specifies the identity of the public will of the king. A lot of provisions for the complete unification of trade and fiscal rights to all the new British subjects are detected that were currently now the subjects of the kingdom are ruled in articles from 3 to 18, and so freedom of trade, navigation, freedom of dominions, the common currency for Great Britain, and the new register of the British trade ships, customs, duties, imports, for they are very, very long and very detailed. Oh my God! I go right to the end. It's on that.
We still have time.
The reinforcement of public debt from England to Scotland, and the most interesting thing that is a feature of the United Kingdom is that the Scottish institutions are valid to the other Scottish institutions are valid to the Union. Article 19 says that all the courts of Scots law were preserved in the continuation of the Court of Station, and all the several Scottish we studied as the Scots law. Article 20 protects our hereditary offices, superiorities, and jurisdictions. In one word, all the traditional legal positions that are not questioned by the new kingdom. The Article 21, the protection of the rights of the royal rulers and of the convention, which is still an important pressure group and the Scottish system of evolution. And after 25, and also the Scottish Mint, the printing of sterling, was that's not least. Still today, I remember just there's three Scottish tracks that are the power to print money, Bank of Scotland and the president there, I think. Well, it is a privilege that was preserved, and at the end, the Article 25 says that there is all the laws that are inconsistent to the articles of the treaty, which means the articles of the Union, are void. So this is a constitutional change, because we know that in the constitutional system of England, there is not a current law that might be a check of the, let's say, legitimacy of the legality of a law. Like this, something in the article was something about an embryo of a rigid rule in the constitutional system whose function as well is to oblige the relations between Scotland or England to observe, to respect to the Catholic Union as a fundamental constitutional law in a country that we usually know that a country where there is not a rigid constitution. Your rules might come from the last article of the Article Union, because it introduces a general unity of the laws in the line of the consistency of the Union. And we will be and so as the Union, the prototype of the rigid constitutional and well, thank you for your attention.
Very much, Sandro. We have 10 minutes, not more.
No more, because we heard the godlike voice.
So 10 minutes of a short discussion about this, to at least reach the second part of this article.
I just recommend people to speak slowly, not because I can, because my listening ability which is rusty.
Firstly, thank you for speakers for this interesting session. I just want to ask you, what do you think about an alternative outcome from a strictly constitutional political point of view of this union, of the Article Union? There was possible an alternative outcome from this union. I recall that during one of the last meetings of the Scottish Parliament, there was one of the Scottish member, Andrew Fletcher or something. about an alternative from a constitutional point of view of the unity. He theorized a constitutional monarchy with strong parliament, with two strong parliaments. So a way to keep the two reigns of reign and distinctive. Putting apart the financial reason and the national financial insecurity coming from the Darien expedition, was it possible alternative outcome from a constitutional political point of view?
Thank you. Who's going to answer you?
Yeah, that's a good question. But I think one way to look at it is the kind of the real world of 18th century politics. So Fletcher of Saltoun articulated these proposals in 1703 and 1704. So, for example, they influenced the 1703 Act to End Peace and War, which essentially said that the consent of the Scottish Parliament was required to take the Kingdom of Scotland into a war. But by 1705, Fletcher of Saltoun is in many respects quite a lone figure. So intellectually he's very good in the sense that his limitations are drawn from the Covenanting Constitutional Settlement of 1640 to 41 and elements of the Revolution Settlement of 1689 to 90 in Scotland. But things have changed by 1705. So most members of the Scottish Parliament aren't like Saltoun. So he's like an intellectual in a parliament with some really quite tough politicians, and he was extremely bad-tempered, and a lot of people didn't like him. But Hamilton's actions on the 1st of September 1705 change everything, because that means the Queen will nominate the politicians who will negotiate a treaty. You know, so he's out of that process, he's out of favour. But where he is quite important, what's also happening in 1705 outside of Parliament is the articulation of constitutional Jacobitism, which Daniel Setch has published on, and I've done some research on what's not published yet. So there are quite viable plans to restore James VIII and III through a French military invasion, but with such constitutional limitations on them that you have no fear over a Catholic monarch. And those Jacobite limitations, they talk about a Jacobite claim of right, are all about restrictions. So Fletcher of Saltoun's limitations influence that. But when it actually comes to the negotiations, the only real game in town is a union of incorporation. And there is also the wider context of there's a major European war being fought, you know, the war of the Spanish Succession.
Yes, and then in the period, the big problem of the international position of England was the first class problem, and that was a period in which England was under the control of generals, let's say, let's think of Marlowe, and of statesmen like Lord And so other projects, like for example the federal project and so on. I read something about the idea of some form of confederation, but I think that there was no way to persuade the English government and the Queen, who wanted to live when was allowed to change well, like when we build the house, and we must live in the best mode, if you want to be able to another and Pacific kingdom. So there was no way to find another. And the idea of parliaments was something like the universal of the crown.
I think there's also a bit of realpolitik. Now, from, like, I know this is from the court side, but for Sir John Clark of Penicuik, you know, even writing in 1746 after the Jacobite Rebellion, for him, Scotland and England could not have separate monarchs. So if Scotland had a different monarch from England, then ultimately Scotland would be invaded and conquered again. And the nightmare scenario was a repeat of the Cromwellian conquest of 1650 to 51, which had a massive psychological effect on people's mentalities.
So there was no way to keep the Scottish Parliament alive, please.
In theory, yes, but in reality, it's the way things. If James VIII and III had converted to Protestantism, then all cards are on the table, but he didn't.
So thank you. I'm sorry, but we have to stop here.
Otherwise we get kicked out, I think. So.